Hello and welcome. I am Elaine Canyon, sweetly writing happily ever after, one book at a time. And in this video, I've got tips and tricks for discovery writers. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. These tips and tricks are things that have worked for me and other discovery writers I've talked to. They're not going to work for everybody, but I hope you'll give them a try and see if maybe these things can help you thrive as a discovery writer. Today we're going to talk about how discovery writers thrive with cycling, and I do not mean a bicycle. Cycling is a form of editing. It's something that I learned to do while writing fan fiction. I would post fan fiction stories and I would write chapter by chapter and post one chapter every week. Saturdays were the days that I would post. So I would write the chapter and then I would go back through and I'd reread it throughout the week and I'd make the edits and changes that I wanted to make until Saturday. And then Saturday morning, I would post the chapter and I'd start working on the next one later that day. And that was how I ran through my writing. So every chapter was edited to the point that I wanted it to be before I ever put it up online. And then I never went back to it. So I do have some fan fiction stories still up where I'm like, oh, I missed that typo, regardless of how many times I read through it. And I think that that's something that we all find, especially when you give yourself such a strict timeline, like a week, to write and then post a chapter. I didn't know what I was doing with cycle editing at that point. And then I started moving into writing original fiction and reading books. And if you have not heard of Dean Wesley Smith or his book, Writing into the Dark, and you are a discovery writer, I highly suggest you go find it. I found it at libraries before. It's definitely worth your time and your money to buy the book or to rent the book and to read it. If there is a discovery writer of all discovery writers, it is Dean Wesley Smith. And we'll talk a little bit more about him later, but his book is what taught me to call this cycle editing. And he goes through and describes it by saying that he writes 400 words and then he goes back to the top of those 400 words and deep dive edits them. And he does that all the way through his book. He compares it to having hills that he has to climb over and he needs a little bit of a running start. And so he will go back to the 400 words that he just wrote and have that as his running start to get up and over the next little hill of white space that he needs to keep filling. But you can use this in any way, shape, or form that you want. So you don't have to pick 400 words. You could do a chapter. You could say, I'm going to write an entire chapter. And then at the end of the chapter, you go back to the beginning and you start working through it and making sure that everything is edited the way that you want it. You also don't have to do a deep dive edit as you go. You could do a surface edit with the intent to come back to the beginning and do a deep dive edit afterwards as a full draft edit instead of doing a chapter by chapter edit or a 400 word by 400 word edit. You also get to choose how far back you want to go. You can choose whether to go back and add in the foreshadowing that you've realized would work really well for something you just wrote, or you can choose to do that later. The whole point of this is to make it work for you. So why would we cycle edit? First, it gives you a much cleaner draft if you've been cycle editing as you go. I talked about how Dean Wesley Smith is the discovery writer of all discovery writers. And I mean that because the man does one draft per book. He does not ever go back and do a second run through of edits. He's editing as he goes. And whatever story he ends up with at the end, that's the story he publishes. Now he's also going through and outlining as he goes, which we talked about with breadcrumbs in a past video. If you haven't seen that, go back. This gives him the ability to look at his structure while he's writing and see what his plot points are and whether or not he likes where the story's going and he likes the shape of the story. He goes back and adds foreshadowing in anytime he needs to add foreshadowing in. He does a whole bunch of stuff, and go read the book. It's so worth the read just because you see this really intense way to discovery, right? He talks a lot about critical voice and creative voice and just letting a story be a story. And it's inspiring. It really is. And it's not, his method is not for everyone. There are definitely going to be discovery writers, myself included, who look at some of the things he does and says, you know what, I know where I am as a writer right now, and I want different things than what he writes. And so I adapt what he talks about in Writing into the Dark for my own uses. And cycle editing is one of them. He does 400 words before he goes back and does a deep dive edit. He will go back and add foreshadowing in at whatever point he realizes he needs it. There's a lot of stuff like that he does that I take a different approach to. When I cycle edit, I will do a lighter edit. I'm looking for things that don't sound like my character. If it doesn't sound like my character, I'm gonna fix it there. I'm looking for the kind of things you would look for in a proofread or a copy edit. This word sounds weird here, or I've used the same word to start 5 sentences in a row. She or he. I have done that a lot. And so I'm looking for that stuff when I go back through. Sometimes I will add in the foreshadowing. I will realize this needs to be foreshadowed and I will go back to where I know it needs to be and I'll put that in. Other times, I don't want to. I'm on a roll and I want to keep going. And so I will put in brackets a reminder that I need to foreshadow it, whether it's the same reminder that Brandon Sanderson uses of remember a bucket. I've done that before. Or I will put in exactly what the foreshadowing needs to be and where I think it needs to go. And I put that in all caps and brackets and I'll keep going because the momentum's there and I'm excited and I don't want to stop. So you can have a really clean first draft, or if you're Dean Wesley Smith, you can have a finished draft at the end by using cycling. And that makes it so your editing does not take nearly as much time as it would if you just ran through and said, oh, well, we'll get to it later. Or you didn't even say we'll get to it later because you didn't go back and read what you had done. Something else that cycling does that I really like is that it can spark your imagination. Like I talked about at the beginning, Dean Wesley Smith uses this to help him get past that white space. He says that that white space is like a hill, and going back and editing those 400 words is his running start to get up and over that hill. I use it when I get a mountain in front of me of white space and I'm not sure where I'm going and I'm not sure what's going to happen next, but I want to know. And so I'll start going back. I'll go back to the previous chapter. Sometimes I'll go back 2 chapters and I will do a medium edit as I'm going through, because what I'm really looking for is for the story to tell me where we're going next. And so I only need to go back usually 2 chapters. There have been times where I have needed to go back to the beginning, but usually I only need to go back 2 chapters and read through those, do a medium edit of those 2 chapters. And by the time I get to where I'm stuck, I'm not stuck anymore. And I know what I'm going to do and I start writing again. Something that I like about cycling is that it helps me check my boundaries. We talked about in a past video, structure and boundaries for discovery writers. If you haven't seen that one, finish this video and then go back and watch that one. But those boundaries, it can be really easy to fall out of them sometimes or to lose sight of them, especially when you're feeling immersed in your story and you feel like the words are coming. And when you're cycle editing, you can check yourself. If you're writing genre fiction, those boundaries kind of matter. Your readers have expectations of what they want to see in your book. For example, I write romance. My readers expect a first kiss. My readers expect a happily ever after. If I'm using a specific trope, there are things that go along with that trope. And being able to make sure that the readers have those things is very important. So cycling lets me check my boundaries. Does each chapter that I've written still show the couple ultimately moving closer together? Your genre might have different expectations, and those would be boundaries that you'd be checking as you're cycle editing. The last thing I want to talk about that cycle editing helps so much with is you are able to find plot holes and breakdowns in your story way earlier than you would if you were not doing this. And I speak from experience because I have caught so many things that would have completely derailed my story a chapter after I wrote them, as opposed to at the end of the book or multiple chapters down the line where I realized this was a bad idea. Because you're able to go back and read it and take that proverbial step backwards from your manuscript. And it helps to show you what is actually happening in your book as opposed to what you think is happening in your book. It's the same as when somebody else reads your book and says, hey, what is actually going on in this chapter? And you realize that you've left something very important out because it was in your head, but it wasn't on the page. I find these things faster when I'm cycle editing than when I do a full edit at the end. When I do a full edit at the end, I'm still getting so immersed in the story that it's easy to lose track of it. But if I'm just doing one chapter, and especially a chapter I've written very recently, it's a lot easier to look at it and say, wait, did I actually say this? Because in my head it was here, but now I'm not seeing it on the page. You're able to focus on each chapter a little bit more because you haven't written an entire book yet. And so each chapter, because you don't usually know where you're going, or at least not how you're exactly getting there, each chapter is easier to look at individually, especially when it's the most recent chapter you've written. So taking the time to cycle edit, especially when you're a discovery writer, but even if you're an outliner, can help you move forward faster. You catch things that you wouldn't normally catch. You're able to check and make sure that your story is going in the line that you want it to be going. And my favorite, that it can spark your imagination to keep you moving forward when you get stuck. Are there tips and tricks that you as a discovery writer use? I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. I post videos on Wednesdays about discovery writing, writing craft, graphic design and cover design, and self-publishing on a teeny tiny budget. I hope to see you back next time.